Alright, today we are talking about Natural Wonders Chapter 12, which is all about glaciers. And glaciers are something that's really important living here in Michigan because glaciers have really determined a lot of the land features that we see right here in Michigan from big to small. From the Great Lakes being carved out by glaciers to just some of the rolling hills that you see across Michigan. It's all because of glaciers. To start out the video, there are going to be a few clips that just really describe how glaciers move, how they grow, and how they recede or shrink. So take some time the first couple days to read through those videos. When we get to our features, it's important to know which ones are erosional features and which ones are depositional. So depositional just means that we're depositing sediment, we're leaving it behind. And erosional means that the glacier is removing and transporting sediment. When we look at number one, a drumlin is a depositional feature. The glacier moves over top of some sort of ridge or obstacle in the bedrock, and as it moves up and over that obstacle, it's going to deposit sediment right behind that obstacle. But because the glacier is still moving, it stretches that sediment ridge out. And as it stretches it out, it does cause it to taper or kind of shrink. So drumlins can show us a direction of movement. It shows us that the glacier moves from the high side of the drumlin, the tall side, and then it travels towards the short side, where it tapers to nothing. Number two is a depositional feature called erratic boulders. And erratic, that word just means random and without any sort of pattern, and that's how these big chunks of rock are deposited. A glacier is more or less just a giant dirty snowball that has a bunch of rocks and material inside that ice. And when the glacier starts to melt, it drops that dirty material wherever the glacier is melting. Number three is another depositional feature called moraines. And there are a lot of specific types of moraines, but for this class, this time, you can just talk about them in general. So any of these pictures you see, you can just identify them as a moraine. But some of the different types of moraines would include lateral moraines that show up on the outsides, the sides of a glacier. There's also medial moraines that show up in the middle of a glacier. And then there's terminal or recessional or end moraines that all show up at the very end of a glacier, and they have different names depending on how they formed or where they formed during either the progression or the regression of a glacier. Number four is our first erosional feature, which is striations. And striations are these really huge scratches put in bedrock by the underside of a glacier. Again, if we think of a glacier like a dirty snowball, it carries a lot of material with it. The bottom of the glacier really ends up being kind of like sandpaper. And since glaciers are absolutely massive, they're very heavy, so it's putting a lot of force on the bottom of the glacier, on that sandpaper, and it actually scratches these grooves into bedrock, and we call those striations. The next little video clip shows the formation of icebergs through glacial calving, which is just when the leading edge of a glacier breaks off into water. And the result is just an iceberg. Not depositional, not erosional, it's an iceberg. Moving on to number five, we have crevasses, and these are simply just cracks that show up in a glacier. So again, they're not erosional or depositional. And the best way I can think of explaining how these crevices form is thinking of winter time, and I don't know about you, but I get dry skin on my hands and my knuckles. And sometimes my knuckles get so dry that they can crack. But if I just walked around all the time with my hands flat and I never bent my fingers, my skin won't crack, it won't break and bleed like it does sometimes. Okay, my skin in winter gets really dry and brittle, and I know that's kind of gross to think about, but if I had straight hands, it would never crack and bleed. What happens to cause them to bleed sometimes is when I bend them. So my dry, brittle skin, when I bend my hand, it's pulled over top of my knuckles, and there's tension on the top of my skin. That tension or pulling on my skin, when it's brittle, it just cracks and breaks and makes a gap. And that's the same thing with a crevasse in a glacier. As a glacier moves downhill, sometimes it moves over obstacles that are underneath it, and it causes the surface of the glacier to bend. And since ice is brittle, it can't stretch, And when it's pulled on the surface, it makes up that tensional force with a gap or a break, and that produces our crevasses. Number 6 is an erosional feature called a cirque, and I like to think of it as almost like an ice cream scoop out of the top of a mountain. This is where a glacier begins. This is the very top where snow accumulates and the glacier begins to move downhill. Number 7 is an erosional feature called an arête, and arêtes separate two glacial valleys. So it's this knife-like ridge that is between two glaciers. Number 8 is an erosional feature called a horn. And a horn forms when 3 or more glaciers are eroding away from the same location. So since they're moving away from each other, they're leaving what's right in between them uneroded, meaning it stands tall and it makes this big almost spike into the sky. We call that a horn. Number 9 is a U-shaped valley. And this is just simply the type of valley glaciers erode. They're not steep and V-shaped like a river might produce. They have these very kind of flat bottoms and this U-shaped curve to their walls. And number 10 is a hanging valley, which also, like a U-shaped valley, could be considered an erosional feature. And just like rivers, glaciers have tributaries or smaller glaciers that kind of feed into and connect to a larger glacier. And since the large glacier has more ice and it weighs more, it's going to erode a deeper valley. The smaller tributary glaciers that feed into it, they're not as big, so they're lighter and they do not erode as deep. So what happens when the glaciers melt is you're going to have this elevation difference between the bottom of the main glacial valley and the bottom of our tributary glaciers. This big drop off that sometimes produces waterfalls is what we call a hanging valley. That's going to wrap up Natural Wonders Chapter 12, which is all about glaciers. If you have any questions, please make sure that you ask. Otherwise, good luck.